Welcome to Chapter 27. This is a summary of the important concepts that you need to understand for female anatomy. I haven't had time to record my entire video, so I figured I would at least just put the summary of the difficult concepts up here for you. So I borrowed this slide and I gave them credit, but this is ovarian tissue. And you can see here there are several follicles and they're growing in size till we get to this really large follicle. We call this a vesicular follicle, and you can see that inside of the vesicular follicle we have the egg, or eventually what's going to be ejected from the ovary, and we call that an oocyte. Quick run through of the anatomy before we start looking at the physiology and some of the processes. Hopefully we can find the ovary right here. We can see the fembrae from the uterine tube. The next section is called the infundibulum, is here. The ampulla is the little widening as it bends. This entire tube is the uterine tube. I know we used to call it fallopian tube, but try to stick with uterine tube. People still use both. This is going to insert on the back side. You can't see it from this sagittal image. This is the uterus. This is the cervix. This is the vagina. We can see the bladder. We can see the urethra. We can see the anal canal. We can see the anus. And then up front here, we have the clitoris. This is our fat pad. And remember your pubic symphysis. So remember this. Here you're going to have the pubic bone, and where the two pubic bones meet, you have a piece of fibrocartilage, and that is your pubic symphysis. Here we have a posterior view of the uterus. So here's the uterus, here's the cervix, here's the vagina, here's the uterine tube, the ampulla, the widening, the infundibulum, the fembrae, and then we have our ovary. Okay, so when we're looking at the ovary, we're looking at several stages of development until we actually eject an oocyte. So these follicles are going to grow in size, and this is small to large. Eventually, the ejection of the oocyte is going to occur, and we call that ovulation. And then the remaining cells from the follicle are going to turn into the corpus luteum. So when we look at the ovarian cycle, you're going to see the terms follicular phase, and then you're going to see the term luteal phase. And what separates these two phases? Ovulation. So the follicular phase is when the follicle is growing. The luteal phase is when the remaining follicle cells are producing hormones. We kind of haven't talked about that yet unless we were in class, but that would be the luteal phase. So when the corpus luteum is active, that's the luteal phase. When the follicle is growing, that's the follicular phase. What separates the two phases? Ovulation, which is the ejection of the oocyte from the ovary. Another nice figure from your book shows the primary follicles growing in size. Maybe I need to switch. Primary follicles growing in size, and they turn into this really large follicle, which is called a vesicular follicle. So this would all be follicular phase. Now we have the ovulated oocyte, or the ejected oocyte, that's ovulation. Then we have this phase, which is called the luteal phase. And this is when the corpus luteum is active. Hopefully you can see that the cells that made up the follicle that are left behind after the oocyte is ovulated, those are the same cells. We just now call it the corpus luteum. Okay, just a quick recap for mitosis and meiosis. I have more detailed with textbook images in the male video if you want to watch it. But before I talk about oogenesis, I just want to make sure we remember this. So mitosis, you go from one cell and you copy yourself and you have two cells, and this is identical, right? Also, remember you are copying chromosomes. So if you have this 2N cell, it actually has to double all of its chromosomes so that you can split them and have two cells that are identical. So we didn't really talk about the chromosome part, but I just want to make sure we realize chromosomes don't just come out of thin air, right? You have to take the ones that you have to copy them before you split them. All right, with meiosis, this is happening in the ovary and testis, or ovaries and testes, either way. So we have one cell, it's going to copy itself into two cells, and then each one of these are going to split into half. So with meiosis, these are not identical. We also start with 1 and we end up with 4. There are 2 divisions, so they'll call this meiosis 1 and they'll call this meiosis 2 using Roman numerals. Meiosis 1, this part, is very much like, it is similar, not exactly, similar to mitosis. This part is not, right? This is you're having the number of chromosomes. So the entire reason that we do this meiosis is so that when we take our 23 chromosomes from our egg and we add it to the 23 chromosomes from our sperm, we end up with a cell that has 46 chromosomes, and that cell can continue to divide until it becomes an embryo and then a fetus and then eventually a newborn. Okay, before we start talking about the words here, let's look at this figure. So this figure is trying to link for you the meiotic events. So they're trying to show you meiosis physiology, and they're trying to link it to the cells that are in the ovarian cycle. The other thing that gets people a little bit is that mitosis happens first, and then eventually meiosis will happen and complete. So remember, we've got 2 phases of meiosis. So what they're saying is we start off before birth with oogonia stem cells. So this is when you're a fetus. And they copy themselves. So we just made an exact copy. Then when you are born, infancy to childhood, so this is before puberty, that primary oocyte is going to start meiosis. So it says primary oocyte arrested in prophase 1 at birth. So basically, your primary oocyte is going to get ready to divide and begin meiosis, but it stops or gets stalled. So we can see here, these are the primordial follicles. This is the next section of that figure from the textbook. So now we're talking about puberty. So puberty to menopause. Your primary oocyte that was stalled during puberty every month, so each month, one of those primary follicles is going to finish meiosis 1. So it says meiosis 1 is completed. So here we started meiosis 1 and we don't finish meiosis 1 until each month from puberty to menopause. So they're showing you the primary follicle, which is stuck in prophase 1 of meiosis 1, doesn't start developing until after puberty, and then each month one of these primary follicles is triggered to grow into a larger follicle. And as it's growing, meiosis 1 will finish. But remember, we're still here, right? We still have another division that has to happen. So this is meiosis 1. This is meiosis 2. Okay, here's the tricky part. We have this secondary oocyte and it stalls again, but now this time it is meiosis 2. So metaphase is just one of the phases of meiosis. Prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. Okay, so we're stuck in halfway through meiosis 2. And this is what causes or decides whether that egg is gonna finish meiosis 2. So if it's not penetrated by the sperm, that egg is going to deteriorate. There's no point in having the egg. It hasn't been fertilized. We're just going to flush it out. If penetrated by sperm, the secondary oocyte completes meiosis too. So let's look at it in the figure on the next slide. Okay, let's look at meiosis versus what's happening in the follicle. They're trying to link these two. So this we already know. We start with primordial follicles. Primordial follicles turn into primary follicles, and then they grow in size, and we call this the follicular phase. Then we have ovulation, and then we have the corpus luteum, so we call this the luteal phase. For the meiosis part, this is what gets confusing. Before we start meiosis, we do a round of mitosis. So remember, mitosis is where we copy and we have an identical copy. So these two cells are identical. The other part is that they don't show you what happens to this one. So let me change the color. They don't show you what happens to this one. All they're showing you is this. So this figure here, they don't show you that there's another one. They're just focused on the one cell and what happens to it. But should you realize that the ovogonium and the primary oocyte are identical, and this happens because of mitosis, and this is before birth. Good. All right, so now we're born. Our ovaries are still inactive, but this primary oocyte is arrested in meiosis 1. So between birth and before birth, fetus and birth, it is growing. So it starts meiosis 1. Now puberty kicks in. So each month, this primary oocyte is going to finish meiosis 1. So every month, one of your primary oocytes is signaled to complete meiosis 1. And we'll talk about the hormones in a minute. So meiosis 1 is complete. And remember, over here, I'll draw it. Here's meiosis. So this is meiosis 1. So what they're saying is this part is complete. Don't let this kind of fool you too much. This should be a 2N. It really is a genetic reference to whether you have all male or all female chromosomes. In the heredity chapter, we'll talk about it a little bit more. I don't want to waste too much time on it right now because we have a lot of other things to talk about. But if you want to just, for right now, if you want to just think of this as 2N, I'm okay with that. I'll explain to you why it's just N later. Over here, we have our secondary oocyte. So what's the difference between a primary oocyte and a secondary oocyte? So the only difference between primary and secondary is secondary has completed what? Meiosis 1. Good. Okay, so here's I'm trying to line them up with this. So we finished meiosis 1. They call this a polar body. I'm going to erase this real quick. I want you to see size. So we said we're just going to kind of fake it right now and say that both of these are 2N. So look at this secondary oocyte compared to the polar body. Tiny little polar body, giant egg. There's a reason for this. The polar body is donating cytoplasm and nutrients because this egg is going to be fertilized and it needs the nutrients in order to start the growth process. Well, again, I keep saying we'll talk about it later, but we will. So we have finished meiosis 1. We've finished the first division. Now we have to divide again. So now we can see our 4 ends down here. So that should kind of make sense to what we were talking about. So here's my 2N. My 2N splits into 2N, 2N, and then each one of those split into a cell that has N number of chromosomes. So here's my first polar body, and here's my secondary oocyte, which has completed meiosis 1. Now we have ovulation, and then the sperm will meet the egg. So if the sperm, that's what this thing is supposed to be, the sperm penetrating the egg, then and only then will the secondary oocyte complete meiosis II. So basically you're conserving time and energy, right? There is no reason for this secondary oocyte to finish meiosis II if it's not fertilized. If it's not fertilized, it's not going to implant in the uterus and it's going to be flushed out of the system. So why waste the energy? You wait for the sperm to penetrate the egg and it sets off a series of events that cause the secondary oocyte to complete meiosis II. This first polar body can divide or not divide. Again, what I want you to see, tiny little polar bodies, one giant ovum or egg. So all of these guys are donating their resources to the growing ovum. So we should look at oogenesis versus spermatogenesis. If you haven't, go back and watch this video. But with oogenesis, you only have one viable ovum. You don't have to always have 3 polar bodies, but you could. So one viable ovum, and it gives nutrients because it takes 6 to 7 days for that ovum, if it's fertilized, to reach the uterus. So it needs food for its journey. The polar bodies are going to degenerate and die. So you cannot fertilize and conceive with a polar body. I guess technically a polar body could get fertilized, but probably wouldn't. And really, we're talking about conception here. So even if a sperm did penetrate a polar body, it doesn't have the nutrients in order to implant in the uterus, and you wouldn't be able to conceive from having a polar body fertilized. All right, so sperm or spermatogenesis creates 4 sperm. So remember with meiosis in males, all 4 become sperm. So you can see there's a difference. We make 1 egg, males can make 4 sperm. I wanted to just mention this error rate. I'm not trying to blame women. I just want you to see that because oogenesis has a lot of stop, start, you know how we kept saying arrested, right? Start, stop, stop, start. Because of all of that, you have about a 20% error rate. In terms of chromosomes could not separate properly, maybe something that DNA is damaged during the division process. So oogenesis has a higher rate than spermatogenesis for errors. So just checking one more time that we understand this ovarian cycle and that we can look at this figure and that we're also thinking about meiosis events. So 1 and 2. So here we have our primary follicles. What has already happened? Mitosis, right? So these guys have already copied themselves and we're at the 2n stage, or 2 times the number of chromosomes, right? So 2 number 1s, 2 number 2s. All right, so what's going to happen to, they're showing you here as well, primary follicles. So what happens when those primary follicles start growing up? So remember that this is arrested in meiosis I. What's the difference between a primary oocyte and a secondary oocyte? So when we go from here to here, what's happened? We have completed meiosis I. So when this ovulated oocyte comes out, it has finished meiosis I. What's it waiting for to complete meiosis II? We're waiting for the sperm to penetrate. When the sperm penetrates the egg, oh, I forgot the R. When the sperm penetrates the egg, then we will finish meiosis II. Our favorite topic, hormone regulation, chapter 16, woohoo! Okay, before puberty, the ovaries are going to grow and they're going to secrete small amounts of estrogen. So we've got a little bit of estrogen here, and that's going to go back to the hypothalamus. and it's going to inhibit the release of GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. So we're stopping or inhibiting the release of GnRH. So if you have no GnRH, that means you have no FSH, that means you have no LH. All right, now at puberty, we have this hormone called leptin, and this comes from adipose tissue. Basically, you have to have enough fat in order to maintain, I should say, it's really necessary in the beginning phases when you're trying to develop a central nervous system. But basically, you need enough fat in order to carry and develop a child during pregnancy. So if you have enough leptin, this hormone decreases the estrogen inhibition. So I'm going to use a different color. So here comes leptin. Leptin comes over here to this estrogen, and it basically decreases estrogen's ability to inhibit. So if leptin turns off the effect of estrogen, then what happens here? We lift this band. If GnRH is being expressed, now what else can we express? FSH and LH. So once we have enough adipose tissue, leptin is going to allow the release of GnRH and then subsequently FSH and LH. So what does GnRH do? It's going to cause the release of FSH and LH. What do FSH and LH do? They're going to cause the growth of the follicle, and they're going to have something to do with hormone release. So remember, this one is the growth of the follicle, and the LH is the estrogen release. So FSH is going to stimulate the granulosa cells to release estrogen, and LH is going to stimulate the thecal cells to release androgens, which are going to be converted into estrogen by the granulosa cell. So these are linked together. You need both in order for the granulosa cell to develop and have the oocyte, secondary oocyte ejected from the ovary. Again, nice figure from our book. Here's our GnRH that came from our hypothalamus. It's going to go to the anterior pituitary and cause the release of FSH and LH. What did we say FSH does? FSH goes to the granulosa cell. This is just one of the intermediate cells, right? So out here you'd have your primary follicle or your primary oocyte, and then remember this cell mass is going to grow into a mature follicle, and this is going to be that vesicular follicle that we saw in the ovary. And then inside here there's the secondary oocyte, which is eventually going to be ejected from the ovary. So FSH is targeting the cells, the follicle cells inside the ovary. LH is targeting the thecal cells. What are both of them doing? Both of them are creating estrogen. So another point that I want to make is as you go from a small follicle to a large follicle, what's happening to the amount of estrogen? You're having increased estrogen. You can also think of it as each one of these cells is secreting estrogen or making estrogen. The more cells you have, the more estrogen you have. So what do you think is going to happen as we go from a small cell to a really large cell? What do you think is going to happen to our estrogen level? Hopefully you're going to see that it's going to rise. All right, next steps. We're going to have negative feedback. So the rising estrogen and inhibin that's being released from the cells is going to inhibit FSH release and LH to some extent. Then you're going to have a positive feedback that stimulates the release of FSH and LH. The estrogen from the dominant follicle increases. We have critically high levels of estrogen, and that causes this FSH, but mostly LH surge at day 14. I know this is confusing. Let's move to the picture. Here we have the FSH and LH, and FSH and LH are on. They're both going to the cells that they need to, either the thecal or the follicular cells inside the ovary, and they're causing estrogen to be released, right? So we're causing increase in estrogen. So the FSH and LH are on. When we have this increase of estrogen, it goes back and tells FSH and LH and GnRH to turn off. Also, inhibin does the same thing. So inhibin is released from the granulosa cells. The way that I think of this is FSH and LH are on. We've told the cell what to do. Now we have to wait. It takes a couple of days to go from this small cell to this very organized, mature follicle. You do not need to secrete FSH and LH. We're doing what you told us to do. We just want you to wait a minute. So FSH and LH are on. Inhibin and estrogen trigger off. So we turn off all of those hormones and we wait. Now we have this giant mature follicle. It is pumping out tons of estrogen, and this high level of estrogen basically signals, I'm ready. I'm ready for ovulation. So which hormones turn back on again? FSH and LH. So the turning on the second time is what actually stimulates the secondary oocyte to be ovulated. And they call it an LH surge. You'll see on the chart, FSH does this, where LH goes off the chart. So LH is the major player here. They call it an LH surge, but you do have a slight increase in FSH as well. Now we move on to step 5. The LH surge is going to trigger ovulation. This LH surge also triggers the primary oocyte to complete meiosis 1 to become a secondary oocyte. So remember that primary oocyte is what's growing into the large follicle. It's going to complete meiosis 1 before we have ovulation. Or it's going to be triggered to happen right at the LH surge, and then you're going to have ovulation. I don't know the timing exactly between the two. When does it complete meiosis 1, and when does the LH surge play out, and when does the oocyte get ejected? But it all happens relatively at the same time. What happens to the ruptured follicle? The cells that remain, they turn into the corpus luteum. So estrogen levels are going to decline. The LH helps transform the ruptured follicle into the corpus luteum, and the corpus luteum is going to secrete progesterone. There is some estrogen. Again, it's secreting both, but primary is progesterone. We also have something called inhibin again. So not just from the granulosa cells. These are the granulosa cells that eventually turned into the corpus luteum. So they also have the ability to secrete inhibin, and this is going to inhibit FSH and LH release. So we were here at the LH surge. We see the ruptured follicle cells turn into the corpus luteum. We see our ovulated secondary oocyte that was triggered by that LH surge. And remember, this secondary oocyte has finished meiosis 1. The corpus luteum, the remaining ruptured follicle, is going to release hormones and that inhibin, which is going to go back and block the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary from releasing their hormones. Remember, we're in a holding pattern. This ovulated oocyte has to go out into the uterine tube and wait to be fertilized. So the corpus luteum says, don't release any more FSH and LH. We got to wait and see what happens if the secondary oocyte is penetrated by the sperm. So now we have negative feedback. So what's the negative feedback? It's because the corpus luteum is secreting estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin. All of that is inhibiting FSH and LH. So if no fertilization occurs, the corpus luteum is going to degrade. You're going to have a decrease in estrogen and progesterone. If this breaks down, you're no longer releasing estrogen and progesterone, so those decline. This blockage, I couldn't get it out, FSH and LH secretion stops. So what's causing FSH and LH to be blocked? Corpus luteum releasing estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin. As soon as the corpus luteum breaks down because no fertilization has occurred, then FSH and LH are going to be able to be secreted again, and we're going to start this process all over again. Let's run through it all again. So here's GnRH, causes the release of FSH and LH. FSH is going to go to the follicular cell and cause it to release inhibin and estrogen. The LH is going to go to the thecal cells and cause them to release estrogen. So the estrogen and the inhibin are going to come back and inhibit FSH release and GnRH release. So at first, FSH and LH is on. Then we're going to turn FSH and LH off, and we're going to do the waiting period, right? We're waiting for the follicular cell to grow in size from small to large. Now we have this mature follicle, and all of these cells here are secreting tons and tons of estrogen. That's a signal to turn FSH and LH back on. So we have our LH surge. There's also FSH here. And what happens? The secondary oocyte is ejected from the ovary. Remember, this secondary oocyte has finished meiosis 1. The ruptured follicle turns into the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum secretes these hormones, which go back and block FSH and LH. So what do? We turn off again. And now we're waiting. We're waiting to see if the secondary oocyte is fertilized by sperm or not. The corpus luteum keeps the blockade going until we find out what happens with the oocyte. The corpus luteum, these hormones are going to maintain the pregnancy until the placenta can take over, until it's developed. So corpus luteum plays an important role in the very first couple of weeks or 2 months of pregnancy. I like the color coding of this slide from your book. So this is the follicular phase, and this is the luteal phase. And what happens directly at this line where we change colors, that's where ovulation occurs. So they're showing you we go from primary follicle. You can also think here, they call it primary oocyte, right? Same terminology. So primary follicle is going to grow in size, and then we're going to have the ovulation of the oocyte. Then you're going to have the corpus luteum releasing hormones, and then they try to show you that this cycle will start all over again if pregnancy doesn't occur or if fertilization of the egg doesn't occur. So the corpus luteum maintains the hormones. If this figure here is showing you no fertilization, because the corpus luteum degrades into this corpus albicans. Now look at estrogen and progesterone levels. So here's the same line. So that line is ovulation. All of this is luteal, and all of this is follicular. So we're going from small follicle to large follicle. What happens? Increase in estrogen. Notice that progesterone is pretty low. Ovulation occurs right when your estrogen is at its peak. Remember, we said that increased estrogen is what signals that LH surge, which is then what signals ovulation. On the back half here, we see progesterone. So in the luteal phase, we see that progesterone is increasing. Remember, progesterone is released by the corpus luteum. It's one of the hormones, right? So during the middle of this luteal phase, that's when your progesterone level is the highest. Now we get to look at FSH and LH. So again, this is follicular. This is signaling ovulation, and this is luteal phase. So what's happening? We're going from a small follicle to a large follicle. We should have a surge of FSH and LH to cause ovulation, and then the FSH and LH are off in the luteal phase while we wait. So this was the on. Then you see how there's kind of a little lull here, and that's the off. Then we've got on again for the ovulation, and then we have off. So I kind of think of this as a light switch. You turn the light on, you turn the light off. You turn the light back on again, you turn the light off. Now we have to link all of this with the uterine cycle. So because they're both called cycle, please make sure that if I ask you about the ovarian cycle, you're talking about the ovary and not the uterus, right? So what does all of this have to do with each other, right? Why do we have to talk about the uterine phase? Well, where's that oocyte going? If the oocyte has been fertilized by the sperm, then that fertilized egg has to implant in the uterus. So we've got to grow the lining of our uterus in order to accommodate this fertilized egg. It needs a nice, squishy, spongy, blood-filled space to implant. So if we just look at what is happening inside the uterus, there are 3 phases. So you have a menstrual phase where the endometrial tissue is shedding off. So this would be no pregnancy, right? Or no fertilization. Then days 6 through 14, this is when we're building the endometrium. So basically we're preparing for a fertilized egg. We may not get one, but we're preparing anyway. And then day 15 through 28, this is what we call the secretory phase, and it's preparing even more for implantation. So you're going to see mucus glands, you're going to see the highest amount of endometrial lining. So in this last part here, this is when we have the highest, and you'll see in the figure, highest thickness, if you will, highest thickness of endometrial tissue. And here's our wonderful picture from the textbook, right? So this is when your endometrial tissue is shedding off. This is when you would have menstruation. This is when the follicle is growing. This is ovulation. And then it takes a couple of days for the egg and the sperm, draw my little images, right, just because I got to have fun. So if the egg and sperm come together, it takes a couple of days before we reach the uterus. Because remember, we have to go from the ovary, and then we've got the fembrae, and then we've got the infundibulum, and then we've got the ampulla, and then we have the rest of the uterine tube. So we got to make a journey, right? What I want you to notice is, when is the endometrial tissue lining the highest? Right here in this secretory phase, but it's also the highest at about the point that the fertilized egg would make it to the uterus. So this is when the fertilized egg is traveling, and it should reach the uterus when the endometrial lining is the thickest. If you don't have a fertilized egg going to the uterus, if the oocyte isn't fertilized and it gets flushed out of the system, it doesn't secrete the hormones necessary to maintain this lining, so the lining goes back to the menstrual phase. So this is if fertilization doesn't occur. So the corpus luteum is going to degrade, progesterone levels are going to fall, the arteries are going to kink and spasm, the endometrial cells are going to die, and basically we're going to have endometrial tissue that's sloughing off. So just think the opposite if fertilization does occur. So if it does occur, you're going to have maintained, I'm going to abbreviate, corpus luteum. So if you have maintained corpus luteum, you're still going to have progesterone, you're still going to have estrogen, you're still going to have inhibin, which is stopping further ovulation. And basically you're building a placenta. The fertilized egg is burrowing into this endometrial lining. So when we get to chapter 28, we'll talk a little bit more about that and the steps that have to take place. All right, that does it for the female summary. Sorry to make it so short, but hopefully I touched on all the parts that are difficult for you.